My name's Andy Glassman. I am a recovering Java developer. I've been working in Elixir for about the last 4 to 5 years, and I've worked on various teams from two-person teams to medium-sized teams, all the way up to massive distributed orgs with dozens of teams and thousands of employees. At all of these companies, one of the top contributors I've seen to productive engineering teams was a focus on administrative tools, not just for the engineering teams, but for the support teams and the customers. I've also seen how a lack of focus on these tools can lead to less productive engineering teams and even employee burnout. I think the best way to illustrate my point is with a story. So the names and the locations and companies have been changed to protect the innocent, or not so innocent. This is a story about the ant and the grasshopper. And you may have heard this fable before, but this is a twist. They both work at the same company, and they work on different teams, and they're building different products for that company. And the company has two very similar products. One was built a couple of years before the second one, so let's take a look at that first one. They both require custom data collection. Basically, the team decided to build their own custom document store. It also involved a lot of custom reporting. So, sorry. Is that better? It sounded loud to me up here, but all right. So the team started out fine. You know, they were getting things done fast. They were getting things done well. They were happy to answer questions for their support team and for their customers, and they were happy to fix issues when they cropped up. So basically, the CTO and the Grasshopper and a couple of the other engineers were able to make changes to the schema for clients on the fly. They would write some code, compile it, upload it to the server, and it would do all the things it needed to do. This was a dangerous thing to do, but it was in trusted hands. Well, over time, the team grew. The feature set grew. The schemas became more complex. Customers started using it for more interesting use cases. And the customer base grew as well. Suddenly, the Grasshopper is getting a little stressed. Well, the people really liked this product. We get more and more customers. They hired more support team. And the clients are doing more crazier things with this data, with this document store. And suddenly, some of those simple changes are getting pushed onto a backlog. Something that a field rename or an addition of a new field that used to take a minute to an hour. Those requests are piling up, and now simple changes are sometimes taking weeks to get done. And the customers and the support team are getting a little frustrated. Meanwhile, it's not like the Grasshopper's on vacation. He's having quite the time over here. So eventually, I'm sure we've all been in this situation. You come in on a Monday and you just see all the Slack messages and you're like, FML, what am I doing? So this is what this approach looks like if we chart it out. When we start out, the project's great. It's a greenfield project. All your engineering time's dedicated to building new features or improving features. But as the project goes on, the client base is going to grow, the number of features are going to grow, there's going to be team turnover, and things are going to get lost in the shuffle. And suddenly, you might find your engineering team is spending more time supporting existing features than building out and improving new features. So luckily, there is a solution for this. And the Cricket salvation is, unfortunately, not the best, but I'm sure we've all heard this before. We need to go slower before we can go faster. Raise your hand if you've ever heard anybody say that at your company. I think we've all heard this. So the Cricket and his team, and their team, is going to have some tough conversation with management and the product team. You're like, hey, we kind of got ourselves into a situation here, and we got to spend some time writing some tools for our support team and our customers and even our other engineers to be able to do these schema changes and whatever's tough in our system to do. And they're going to have to allocate a portion of their budget that's going to bump up, eat into their already low engineering time for new features, and those things aren't going to be effective on the first day. It's going to take some time for those changes to improve the situation. And ideally, they're going to get down to this area, which is There's peaks and valleys. There's going to be times where support issues do crop up, but they'll be able to integrate those fixes and those support processes into the admin tools as long as they're continuing to focus on it. So how did the Cricket and their team solve this schema problem? Well, a dedicated effort was put in by the team, first of all, to just shrink that backlog from weeks long to a week long. And when the backlog got under a week long, they had a party. Next, a resourceful engineer came up with a DSL, so they didn't have to write and compile changes and upload them to the server. The DSL was also able to make sure that the changes people were making were safe. If they were unsafe, they would get a warning, and it would prevent them from running those changes. This allowed the engineering team to train the support team to make these schema changes in a safe way, and it was scalable. So they didn't have to sit down one-on-one with the engineering team to figure out how to do something. It was self-service. And over time, they got into a much better situation. Now, complex changes could be turned around in 1 to 3 days, and the simple changes could be done in minutes or hours. So, let's take a look at the next project that this company worked on. And the ant, we'll see what the ant approach to this is. Now, the ant and the grasshopper, I'll give you a secret, are the same person. They've just learned from their mistakes. So, the product involved here is very similar. It's a complex, customized data collection with customized data reporting, with the addition of customized and complex workflows on how that data can move through the system. So the ant also gets things done fast at the beginning of the project. They get things done well, and they're happy to answer questions, and they're happy to fix issues. So what was the big differentiator here? They wrote admin tools for their team as part of their everyday work. And this is what, from day one, the ants team looks like. They start off with a portion of their budget dedicated to writing and providing self-service admin tools for their team. This allows them to have a significant time of their budget dedicated to improving and developing new and improving features. And yes, there are going to be times when the support issues get out of hand and they're resolved, and that will go up and down, but it's more manageable. It's never going to grow out of control. So be like the ant and write admin tools from day one. So I've been wanting to write this blog post for a while, and I finally did it because I've seen admin tools be superpowers for teams basically since I got into the industry. And it had some differentiating opinions on Hacker News. So, of course, you get somebody that's saying, I can't agree, I don't agree with this. Like, you should really only ever build an admin tool if the time it takes to develop it was less time than it takes to do the tasks. And somebody else said, that can't possibly be right. At least wait till product market fit, which sounds good in theory. And I have arguments against both of these. And of course, you get the obligatory, it depends in the XKCD, which is basically just this one where it says, here's a timetable of when you should automate something to make it make sense. But I think this is a bad way to think about this situation. You can't think of it as the time spent needs to outweigh the time saved. What you're really trying to minimize here are interruptions for your engineering team. You want to minimize context switching, you want to minimize burnout, and you want to avoid knowledge silos. So yes, there could be 1 or 2 engineers on your team that know how to do something, but if the act of making them automate it or put it into a tool makes it much more easier for someone else on the team or somebody outside that team to learn how to do it. So I fall into this camp, obviously, of opinions. So someone said that the value of an admin tool goes way up when they enable someone to do or to self-service, which I agree with. As somebody said, at an absolute minimum, I would say that when you have to do an admin task twice through messaging or messing with the database or something, is when you should probably add an interface to it. That might be a little extreme, but I'll give some strategies on how you can think about when to automate things. Also, has anybody ever used Django? Like, it's pretty amazing what you can do with their admin tool. And the one that I agree with the most was, this has been our approach as we scaled from customer 1 to acquisition by Big Co a decade later, and I'd still point to it as being a key driver of our success. I didn't write that. But Uh, Other people have had similar sentiments as myself. So what do I consider an admin tool? I consider an admin tool any user interface, documentation, process, or integration that makes you, your team, your organization, or your customers more self-sufficient or more efficient. And these can be things like system visibility, ability to modify data, automated support actions, queryable audit trails, and accurate documentation. So I'm going to show you 3 different ways that I've used in the past to implement admin tools. We'll go over web admin interfaces, we'll go over how to maintain and generate accurate documentation, and also how to leverage third-party tools like databases and logs in interesting ways. So I think if you're going to start anywhere, I would say start with an admin web user interface. I like to think of an admin web user interface like a Trellis. So as we know, software likes to get messy over time. And a Trellis, basically, if you don't know what it is, it's a way to help certain types of plants grow. So a climbing plant, if it doesn't have a trellis, is just kind of going to grow wherever it wants. And if it has a trellis, it will grow on the trellis versus just sticking on the ground and prevents rotting and overall helps the plant stay healthy. So software is definitely a messy plant. And we know it can turn into spaghetti code and messy systems that are hard to understand. So I like to think of this as a trellis for your software. Specifically, there's 2 main approaches that I see for implementing this. The easiest one you can use is an existing framework. So in Elixir, there's Caffe, or Coffee, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, and Torch, and then there's a bunch of other ones for every stack. And then there's stack-independent tools. I haven't tried these, but I think they're really interesting, and I want to look more into this. So things like Retool, Directus, and Knock is using airplane.dev, which I just found out yesterday and added, so ask Chris if you want to know more about that. The first thing you should do once you take like the 10 to 15 minutes it takes to set up one of these frameworks is make it easy to find. So a lot of times, if you've ever had to use an admin tool, you might have had to go search through a SharePoint site or a wiki, or ask your coworker on Slack, hey, where's that admin tool again? So I think an important thing to do for your team is put it in your software. If I'm logged in as an admin or somebody that has admin access, just make a link to it. And this has saved us at the company that I work at, Sway, a lot of times. We're a small team, and we're on the go. So even on mobile, I can go into our admin tool and check something for somebody, or they can go into the admin tool and kick off a job or do some support for a customer. Second is start simple. You don't have to add a whole CRUD flow for every schema you have in your app. When we first integrated Caffe, we only had, now you can see where we have a ton of things now, but we started off with just accounts, users, and profiles. And we started off with just being able to read profiles. You couldn't even, I locked down the edit and the in deleting and things like that. But over time, now that we have the framework in place, it can take 1 minute to add a new field or 1 minute to change how something interacts. And then you just expand on it over time. You can also you can hook right into functions. So if I want to, for us, we deal with applying promotions to specific users. I didn't have to write a whole user interface for our support team to be able to apply and manage promotions. I just wrote a function that takes an email address or something, and then it can show up in Caffe, and I can just execute it. But over time, you might find that your support processes outgrow the framework. If you think of using a framework like Caffe as buying a trellis from Home Depot, you can think of the next step after that as building a custom trellis. So one of the things we found we were doing the most was looking up user profiles and trying to understand how that person was using the system so that we could help them use it more efficiently. So we ended up building a custom admin tool specifically just for profiles. So when we started, our custom trellis only had you could search by username and email. It would give you a list, and we only had one tab, which was profile. But that gave us another custom trellis to build into, where we could build out as we found out the things that we want to do with profiles over time, and it was a little clunky to do in Kafi, we just moved it over here. And something that I found over time is that the more you focus on building these types of tools, the better they work with each other. So as you can see, we had a Kafi tab. Well, what does the Kafi tab do? Well, we still use Kafi a lot for a ton of different parts of the system. But now, if you want to look at something from the view of a user or profile, first you look up their profile, and then you can get a link to any part in Kafi filtered for that user. So I don't have to go find that view and then hope that the search works to find that user within that view. I just give them a filtered view, like, oh, I want to go see what payment methods this customer has. Just go right, find them, bam. So these tools start to really build off each other. So overall for web admin UI, I would say make it easy to access. Start simple. Don't try to boil the ocean with your admin tool from the first day. Start restrictive and then expand it over time. Also, make a super obvious indicator of what environment you're in. I'm not speaking from experience, but you definitely don't want to make a change in test that ends up in production, or even think you're changing something in production, but really you're in a test environment. Just bad luck. Hook into other libraries. So we use Fun with Flags for feature flagging, and we use Oban. And hooking those schemas into Kafi was super easy. So I can now just filter down to all the feature flags for a user, or I can see what jobs have failed. I can kick off a job. I can expire a job or retry a job, and I don't have to install a whole nother admin interface for that. Also, integrate with other admin tools. As you see, they start to really build off each other, and you gain a lot of momentum that way. Also, try to cram as much documentation and help you can into the tool. Basically, you don't want somebody to have to scratch their head and figure out how to do something, then either have to ask you, which defeats the purpose, or go find something in another wiki. So if you do need to link to external documentation, put the link in there. Don't just have them search it up. Which brings me to my next section, accurate documentation. So one thing that I've always been a little obsessed with is self-documenting code. And if you've ever worked in a system that has a lot of feature flags, user roles, notifications, a lot of times you're seeing it used in the code and you're like, what does this feature flag mean again? Yeah, it's kind of self-descriptive, but is it deprecated? Is anybody using it? So something that we did at Sway from when I first built these systems was to make a struct of all the feature flags and give them some basic key value descriptors. Are they deprecated? And then luckily somebody had already done this, but basically using earmark, we can write Phoenix templates in Markdown. So I don't have to think about how am I styling this. I can just write Markdown that's generated into HTML. So that makes it super easy to just document all the feature flags in the system. And we do this for user roles, notifications, and a ton of other things. Here, I'm using the same Markdown to just list out all the different sections we have of our admin tool, definitions like Google Tag Manager tags, things like that. So in general, for auto-generating documentation, Xdoc is great. I think it's a little bit more developer-focused, and if you send your support team or other team members to Xdoc, they might get lost in some of the other things in there. Use Earmark. It's a great library for whipping out templates really fast without having to worry about writing HTML. Two stack-independent tools I really like to use are ASCII Doctor and Plant, UML. I use this for a lot of internal documentation for architecture. You can make sequence diagrams. You can do all this cool stuff. And I made a mixed task that will run a Docker container and publish these as a static directory. So if anybody wants to see that, I can show you later. Another useful approach that I use for documenting these things is just to record a video. So if I make a new feature in the admin tool, I just record myself using it, write up 2 sentences of how I used it, and then link to that from the admin tool. And that gives people an easy way to rewatch it at their own pace without having to bug somebody else, me, or anybody else on the team on how to use it. As always, I'm happy to answer questions for the team, but there's so much of a tool that like sometimes I even forget, so I'll go look at my own documentation. So this is going way faster than it did. Am I talking too fast? Okay. Documentation or third-party tools. So we all have used things like log aggregators, dashboards, databases, things like Postman as engineers, and they're super useful. But has anybody ever had like a product manager or a support person who has like super interested in SQL or their API? Like there's usually one, which is great, but we can take these tools and make them even easier for these teams to use. So like, yes, there's always going to be the one person who's super interested in it, but we want to make this useful for the whole team. So one way I do that is by using like a plug to add metadata to the logger. So a lot of times I've seen companies will only add ID, like a user ID. But I always try to add a human readable identifier, whether that's just like their full name. I try to minimize the PII, but if it's just like their display name, then this makes it much easier for people who are just looking through the logs to see exactly like who's doing what, versus having to like say, oh, I see this one UUID a lot. Wonder who that is, and they have to highlight it, go to a system, search it, figure it out, and then like remember. I know I've worked at places where like customers were just referred to by like 4 or 5 digit numbers, and they'd be like, oh yeah, that's just like customer 22345. I'm like, I don't know who that is, but sure. And again, the web admin framework is like a constant cornerstone of making these other tools more effective. So once I get a good, like a saved view in Datadog, I'll just copy the URL and then use string templating to drop their username in there. So now when I search up a user, if they're saying like, hey, I'm having issues setting up SMS, I don't have to go find the Datadog link, make sure I'm in the right environment, go find the save views, put in their username. I can just look them up here and click on SMS errors or their performance dashboard. And so here I brought right to their SMS view, and I can see, oh, here's why they're having issues. They're not in a country we currently support. So aside from logs, there's a lot of things you can do to make logs useful for your team without making it overwhelming. The same approach doesn't quite apply to databases because they're a little bit more complex, but I still have a few approaches that I've used in the past that have been pretty successful. So to start out with, you could just start saving all the SQL you've run for your team in a shared repository. I usually recommend not keeping it in the same repository as your code, because it can be messy. It can conflict with like CI/CD if you want to check something in. So I just like to keep it separate. But anytime somebody asks for like an OKR query, like how much is a certain feature being used, or support queries, I just put it in this repo. And then over time, as the company matures and you have other teams, you'll put these into a view, and these views can be used easily pulled into an analytics tool, or these views could easily be used in like a CAFE action that says, hey, email me a CSV dump of this query. And if you have tech-savvy users who want to be able to access that data, well, giving them a specific user that only has access to your approved views is a really easy way to let them play around with data without the possibility of them breaking anything. So an interesting solution to this problem that I worked on with a DevOps person at a previous company was trying to provide a support team and customers in a way to look at data without them having to download a SQL client, set up connections, set up a tunnel, all that stuff that we know it takes to get access to a database. So what we ended up doing was putting pgadmin in a container and then using role-based access controls and LDAP integrations and things like that to basically spin up a pod that only has access to a read replica that only is injected with the credentials for the support user that has access to specific views. So when they want to look at data, they can just go to a URL, load up pgadmin, and look at that views without having to go through a bunch of processes, like setup processes. Let's see. Here's an interesting one that I have found useful. I don't know if I'd 100% recommend it for everybody, but one of the previous companies I worked for was this was with a workflow engine. It was heavily API driven. And if you've ever downloaded or gotten an open API schema or a Postman collection from a company that provides an API, it can be overwhelming if you're not a developer. So if you get it as a developer, you're it's useful in that format where it's here's just a listing of every route with every get, post, put I can do, and it might be configured to work out of the box, but probably not. What I found to be much more useful is to provide support team and customers with a collection that actually is configured to do useful things for them. So it's not just a listing of the whole API. For example, I might provide them a collection that has a grouping of data fixes or a grouping of data exports. And yeah, there might be 10 requests in there that are all hitting the same endpoint, and they all might be post requests, but they're all configured specifically for a certain scenario. So there might be one that's here's audit trail for XML. Here's audit trail in CSV for the past 30 days. Just take out the guesswork for them. They put in their credentials and they run it. So there's a couple ways. You can either write this by hand in a JSON format in your code base and have it auto-published to a shared repository. They can download it, or you could auto-generate it. So at this previous company that I worked at, this was a Java stack, they have a framework called Spring REST Docs. And what it was intended for was basically intercepting a web test and then documenting it in different interesting ways to inject into an ASCII document. So you have a web request and you want to show how to do that as curl. So it would generate these snippets oh, here's how you do this request with curl, or here's what this response looks like in XML or JSON or whatever format. So I hooked into that and basically made a whole test suite of here's useful things you can do with our API as an admin. And then it captures those and generated a Postman collection that was auto-published and downloadable. So I've only just started this, and it's a pet project that doesn't really apply to my current work, so I don't know when it would be before I actually publish this anywhere. But I was able to get this working in Elixir for OpenAPI. So basically in your test config, you give a base descriptor of your OpenAPI document. You import this OpenAPI module, and then at the end of your test, you do a capture. So this will only run if it's a successful test. And then you give it some overrides if you'd like, and then it'll generate a snippet of OpenAPI in JSON format. And it'll put it in a temp directory. And then there's a mix task that will run and merge all these documents together into one OpenAPI document, which then you could serve up through a static URL or you'll push to some sort of repository that your team can download. And the beautiful part about this is that it's going to be correct because the tests, if they fail, this won't be published. It'll be versioned, so you can get a version for every specific API version that you have, and it'll always be correct and available. You don't have to fiddle around with checking in changes and hoping that they still work. So overall, incorporate admin tools into your engineering budget from the first day. Think of the admin tool like a trellis. It should be a framework that your software can grow onto. And start small, don't boil the ocean, start small and grow this tool over time. And they're going to be, the more tools you add, the more they're going to interplay with each other and the more effective they're going to be for your team. So make it easy for your team. Tie the systems together. Try to auto-document and auto-generate whenever possible. And build this for the support team and the clients. Yes, you can always build tools for your engineers, but don't build this only for engineers. Try to make it as easy as possible for your team. So basically what I'm saying is, be like the ant. Start building admin tools from day one. Keep your engineers focused on delivering and improving features, and build admin tools. Thank you.